In this PowerPoint for Chapter 1, I will highlight some of the key areas discussed in the text. To start, when we talk about substances or drugs, we need a framework to accurately identify what the term psychoactive drugs means. Oftentimes, the term drugs or substances bring to mind only illegal substances. Based on the text, this would be a misperception as both illegal and legal substances can actually fall under the term psychoactive drug. So in the treatment field, when we are referring to psychoactive drugs, we are actually referring to any substance, legal or illegal, that affects thoughts, emotions, and/or behavior and can alter consciousness. The text presents 5 basic principles that apply to all psychoactive drugs. The first is that use of a substance does not automatically mean someone has a substance use disorder. Use does not always equal abuse. This idea can often cause confusion or misunderstanding because social messages often present the idea that any use of a substance, especially an illegal substance, means that a person has a quote-unquote problem. The process in diagnosing a person with a substance use disorder actually involves looking at many features and areas. Many people who use a substance do not fall under the category of having a substance use disorder, and not everyone will progress in their use to develop a disorder. The second is that every drug has multiple effects. This refers to the idea that all psychoactive drugs act on more than one place in the brain and impact other parts of the body. Third, as the text states, amount matters, meaning both the size and quality of a drug's effect depend on the amount the individual has taken. While there are other factors to consider with this issue, what this principle looks at is the relationship between dose and effect. Fourth, history and expectations have influence. Here, the full effect of any psychoactive drug depends partially on the individual's own history and expectation. More specifically, this refers to factors such as how long a person has been using a particular substance and the belief in how a person will be impacted. The text gives an example that when a person believes that alcohol will make them more social and extroverted, that the person can end up being more talkative and outgoing after consuming just a small amount. Every individual will have a different history and expectation of the substance, and while sometimes surprising to believe, this does play a part in the full impact the substance will have on the person. Lastly, drugs per se are not good or bad, meaning the substance itself is merely a chemical and the chemical itself is not good or bad. Again, this is often seen as controversial because on a societal level, we are used to hearing that certain substances are inherently good while others are inherently bad. However, generally, the real concern about substances pertains more to the way it is used and any potential outcome that might be harmful. In addition, there's actually more concern about the behaviors that can stem from use, the possibility of substance use disorder developing, and the harmful consequences that can arise from its use. Moving from the definition and principles of psychoactive drugs, we want to take a look at what social concerns surface around psychoactive substances. In a sense, the idea of the quote-unquote drug problem, which actually can be more complicated due to the fact that humans have used for thousands of years psychoactive drugs for therapeutic and recreational uses. So there's a need to differentiate between uses that contain some therapeutic, medical, and/or cultural spiritual use versus quote-unquote drug use concerns. Historically, we have often asked questions such as who, what, when, where, why, how, and how much as it relates to a specific substance and its use. Often, the use of these basic questions can help us get a more detailed and accurate account of substance use and can help to avoid tendencies to overgeneralize, stigmatize, and stereotype. In this attempt to get more accurate information, even with investigational or research studies, there are inevitably many hurdles to obtaining a realistic overall picture of substance use. A factor in these hurdles stems from research data that is generated. Too often there is little information regarding the source of the data as well as how difficulty it can be to obtain more than just superficial data or information on a range of issues. For example, with topics such as trends in substance use or terms to use when discussing substance use, within research itself there can be confusion regarding what really constitutes a trend at both a local and a national level, as well as confusion over how a term is really defined and its accuracy. Too often these challenges result in the perpetuation of inaccurate or misinformation, which can be heightened by media attention. A related hurdle is in how historically we have obtained information pertaining to substance use and those impacted. Survey questions have largely been the main source due to how easy they are to use and their flexibility. However, there are significant drawbacks involving who is selected and the potential inaccuracy of the self-reports. Coming back to the topic of drug trends, this has been and continues to be a main area of interest both in society and academic research. In general, two research areas are identified: prevalence of use and perceived risk and availability. When looking at trends from a research perspective, the factor of correlates surface. A correlate in regards to trends in substance use is trying to identify what factors seem related to substance use. But a correlate does not imply a cause, only merely identifies a possible relationship between the two. Focusing on substance use, two common correlates that are investigated are what we refer to as a risk and protective factor. Risk factors such as the availability and access of a substance and having friends who use are connected to higher rates of use as outlined in the text, while protective factors such as having negative perceptions of substances and the potential consequences with use are connected to lower rates. However, here again there is much more to the picture. What can be a risk factor to one person may actually be a protective factor for someone else. For example, when working with clients, I have had many who mention that being a parent is a protective factor. Likewise, I have also had parents who share that the stress from being a parent results in a risk factor for substance use. So it is very important to identify with each client what their own protective factors and risk factors may be. Other correlates when looking at trends in drug use can be more controversial. The text mentions correlates of social class, gender, and others. However, a question arises if these are valid correlates or more connected to misinformation concerning substance use, which can reinforce stereotypes. So it is important to show caution in this area, as there can be a tendency to selectively refer to correlates that might support a preconceived belief or stereotype, and reject others that do not fit what is expected. A final area to look at in drug trends is the factor of antecedents. An antecedent is viewed as a factor that occurs before someone begins using substances. While these are still not causes to substance use, some have looked at factors such as aggressiveness and poor academic performance as existing before substance use starts. Here again, as the text points out, it is important to proceed with caution, as antecedents can also be used to form or reinforce stereotypes when other variables are actually involved. A major debate within this topic is the concept of a gateway drug. This term gained popularity in the 1970s as the progression of use from a substance like tobacco or alcohol to what was perceived as a more dangerous substance. This was discussed and debated, and it often implied that alcohol and tobacco were soft substances that created an initial impairment, which then made one susceptible to progression to harder and illicit substances, meaning that there were steps and a certain order to using substances, each step leading to a more harmful use and potential negative consequences. However, currently, we have much more information and data regarding substance use than we did in the 1970s, which raise questions about the validity of this perception of a gateway substance. First, as we have discussed previously, this progression is not everyone's path. Along with that, progression of use of alcohol and tobacco alone can produce harmful outcomes. Moving to other substances is not necessary to potentially create harmful consequences. Likewise, there are many instances where someone begins using substances with a type that might be considered quote-unquote harder, or an illegal one. While legitimate concerns of the validity of this term have come into question, that does not necessarily mean that the concept should be thrown out altogether. There can still be value in evaluating what leads to escalation of use. As the text mentions, a cross-cultural study in this area highlighted that the order of use can be highly varied across cultures, and that the influence and progression of use can actually stem more from social and cultural factors. When looking at correlates and antecedents in connection to one another, the text highlights that we are often trying to understand two motives. First, what influences, encourages, or motivates a person to try a substance, and second, what factors or influences become a type of reinforcer or positive reinforcement for the person to want to continue and repeat using a substance. Meaning, what is occurring that increases the chances for a person to keep using the substance. The text identifies three main spheres of influence for these areas: individual, community, and family or societal. Looking at examples within each sphere helps us, as a provider, to gain a deeper understanding into which factor or combination of factors can play a role in someone trying a substance for the first time, as well as the continuation of use and potential for progression.